That's the perfect introduction, because I want to talk about how I approach this subject. Brooklyn is not China, but it's huge, and maybe the second largest migration in human history. People moving to Williamsburg and Greenpoint. So this book was a recovery operation of sorts, an excavation into buried, lost, forgotten chapters of Brooklyn's very deep history. I like to think of it as an effort to unpack what the historian Reinhard Koselleck called, and I quote, the one-time futures of past generations. So how do you start a project? How did I start this project? Telling the story of a place as richly layered as Brooklyn. I was at a party back in the fall, and I was talking to this woman, and I told her I had written a book about Brooklyn. This was in Brooklyn. And she said, well, what about Brooklyn exactly? I mean, that's like writing a book about life itself. So this is in Williamsburg. And so where do you start? And I realized quite early on that I needed to determine or find some formative axes about which to hang this story. And I want to talk about these today or tonight. Several formative axes, and that not only have shaped the place that Brooklyn is, but its soul and its spirit too. And the first of these is the land itself, and specifically its glacial topography. Right, you all know about the last period of glaciation, the last ice age. Right, it's technically the Laurentide ice sheet that came down from the Arctic, and this was the architect, really, the shaper of New York State and much of the Northeast. Right, it carved the Finger Lakes, gouged out the Hudson Valley, ground down the Adirondacks. And it got to the future side of New York City, decided I've seen enough, I'm going back to Canada, and it reversed gears. Actually, it came down twice. Came down, reversed, thought better of it, and then finally went. And it left us this great pile of crap, which we call Long Island. Right? And of course, I say that being, Brooklyn being part of the butt end of that. So this is the if you can imagine the glacier as a giant bulldozer blade. It just, when it reversed, it just left this behind. And this is the high spine here of this moraine is Walt Whitman's Brooklyn of Ample Hills. Right, it's that high spine that runs from all the way across the island. There's actually two. There's the Harbor Hill moraine and the Ronkonkoma moraine, but they more or less converge for most of their length. I should say, by the way, that I was really astonished to learn this. The Laurentide ice sheet is still with us. There's a tiny remnant of it on Baffin. I always call this Banff Island. Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. It's called the Barnes Ice Cap, and it's not very big, but this is actually very old ice. Maybe not what you're looking at here, but it's over a mile deep, and it is actually the remnants of that great glacier that shaped so much of our topography and landscape here, and so much of our history subsequently. I would love to go up here and get some of this ice and bring it back, but that would be an expensive little trip. So the high spine of this glacial pile, this is a little topography map that one of my students helped me make. The topography is exaggerated here for effect, but this is looking from over the Narrows east, basically, right? And this is the terminal moraine, right? The high spine. And that's, you don't even need a map to fathom where this is. You just need to look at place names, right? You have Bay Ridge, Park Slope, Brooklyn Heights, Crown Heights, right? Prospect Park, and so forth and so on. And this terminal moraine is really something of Brooklyn's continental divide. Right? It cleaves the borough into two hemispheres, an older, hillier, Manhattan-oriented northern hemisphere, and this broad, low-slung southern hemisphere that, as James Agee put it in an essay, lies as flat and huge as Kansas, right? And much of this was rural, largely rural, into the 1920s, including the neighborhood I grew up in. My street actually went from farm, rows of vegetables to houses within a 2-year period in the mid to late 1920s. And this glacial binary, right, terminal moraine, outwash plain, has really shaped Brooklyn for over 300 years, and it's still a key to understanding the city today, right? If you map creative class Brooklyn, right, you'll see a glacial ghost appear before your eyes, right? Morainal Brooklyn, Brooklyn of the terminal moraine and north is brownstone Brooklyn, right? It's the luxe and gentrifying city. It's the dominion of, the batch-made, the cruelty-free, the grass-fed, the, fixed gear, the generally unaffordable. Outwash Brooklyn is, in many ways, it's opposite. It's not that simple, but it's still a striver's city of working-class and middle-class bedroom communities. It's a place still scored by many of the old lines of race, class, and religion. There are communities there, as I'm sure many of you know, that have closer ties to Kingston or Tel Aviv or Fuzhou or Kiev than to the rest of the United States. The outwash plain in many ways is like, I think of it sometimes as Gotham's flyover country. It's often omitted even from maps of Brooklyn, and I'll show you an example in a minute. This is just mapping development and over time. This is 1900. The little purple blotches are buildings, and you can see that development starts obviously from the East River. Brooklyn sort of turns the polarity of Manhattan on its head, right? Manhattan starts in the south and goes north. It gave us that dynamic of downtown and uptown, right? Brooklyn's the opposite. It starts in the north and it crawls its way up the terminal moraine and then stalls out around 1915 or so. And it's not until the great building boom of the 20s and into the early 30s, which was largely stoked by a 10-year tax holiday on new construction, that you have the city basically sweep down the outwash plain to the sea, where of course there had been plenty of development at Coney Island and spots here and there. This is actually a map showing what our future is in the New York metropolitan area, under 100 feet of water. This was done by Jeffrey Lynn. The Palisades basically is all that we have left. But anyway, I like it because it actually shows the terminal moraine here and the outwash plain. These little dots here, not so easy to read, but these represent cafes, bookstores, art galleries. And again, you can see these are two different worlds in multiple ways. I'm playing a little fast and loose with this. But you get the point. Here's a map. Explore Brooklyn, except don't think about going south of Ditmas Park because there's nothing to see. Usually you get a call-out box for Coney Island, but that didn't even make the cut here. So the second formative agent or axis that I look to here in the development history of Brooklyn is this fateful adjacency of Brooklyn to this place here, to Manhattan, right, to New York as it was known solely prior to Consolidation. New York begat Brooklyn, but without the latter, the great city really would never have become what it is today. New York was land poor, rocky, girdled by water. Frederick Law Olmsted actually called it a walled town. Right, and it really would have choked on itself had it not access to a vast and very productive hinterland, right? And that hinterland, in many ways, was Brooklyn. Brooklyn fed the great metropolis. It took its trash. It buried its dead. It became a displacement zone of sorts for peoples and practices untenable or unwanted in the center. right? Suspect religions, racial outcasts. Slavery was as prominent especially in the Outwash Plain, on all the large Dutch farmsteads, right? Slavery was as prominent here as in parts of the South, right? Morally citizen nonconformist, dirty industrial operations later on, all sorts of amusements and entertainments that were considered morally dubious or polluting, right? This is a Currier and Ives illustration of one of the great races at the Sheepshead Bay racetrack, which was on the border of Sheepshead Bay and Marine Park. It's completely gone. There's not a trace of it left. But this, so over the moat, right? The moat being the East River, over across the river. None of these things posed a very direct threat to the stability and the kind of moral order of the inner sanctum, right, of New York, of Manhattan Island. But now, if Brooklyn fed and fueled New York, the reverse was also true, right? And what you have evolving between the two is a very robust and competitive kind of symbiosis, right? New York is clearly dominant, but for most of the 19th century, Brooklyn matches New York drink for drink, right? Move for move. It's like the ambitious kid brother who's punching above his weight, right? And this relationship is formalized. And just a couple of illustrations of what this could mean. You know, New York builds Central Park. Well, Brooklyn turns around, hires the same guys to do a better job on a much more amenable site. You know, with Prospect Park, which is, I think most would agree, it's their greatest work. And not only do they create a magnificent park, it's here that Olmsted and Vaux, it's mainly Olmsted in this case, are encouraged to lay out a greenway system, right? A system of parkways to create this, to reach out to the metropolis and engage points east on Long Island. Even, I mean, Alex, you probably have seen these plans. You know, Olmsted wanted Eastern Parkway to actually hook north and head over to what was known as Blackwell's Island at the time, cross Roosevelt Island, and eventually join to Central Park. I mean, it was nuts, and this was all rural countryside at the time. So this was really visionary. Of course, you know, Ocean Parkway is driven south to Coney Island, and Fort Hamilton Parkway is never really fully built, but that was to go to the Narrows. Well, you know, the point at which this relationship is consummated, right, for better or worse, is on the evening of December 31st, 1897, right? This is Consolidation, which creates the city that we know today, the five-borough metropolis of greater New York, right? It overnight makes New York City the largest city in the world after London. And in time, Consolidation will profoundly change the kind of DNA, the genetic code of Brooklyn, and not for the better, right? But for a generation or so, the ambitions of both places really fused beautifully, right? And this is the cover of the Consolidation issue of the Eagle, in which the five boroughs are somewhat, I would say, improbably represented as virginal maidens. And of course, you know, so this is so Brooklyn's Anglo-Dutch elite, right, which had largely opposed Consolidation, is undeterred in its great plans for their city, right, now borough. Right? And this is the era, for example, of the Brooklyn Beautiful movement, right, which is led by, and this is a great illustration of that ambition, right? This is obviously a cartoon, but this notion that Brooklyn would naturally, in a kind of reverse manifest destiny, head east, right? Take over the Hamptons, clearly, but go all the way out to Montauk Point. And essentially turn Long Island into this great mega borough and gateway to America, right? And so this Brooklyn Beautiful movement, I have a whole chapter on this fellow here and this movement that he founds. This was the urbanist minister, as I call him, of Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights. He had succeeded Henry Ward Beecher to the pulpit there. Actually, there was one minister between them, but he doesn't matter. And this fellow, and of course, you know, this was the most powerful pulpit in America. It really was. I mean, Henry Ward Beecher helped launch the abolition movement, and he was a flawed individual, but nonetheless. And so this guy had a true bully pulpit, right? He had a lot of power. He seemed to be more interested in urban planning than God. You know, at this time, the Brooklyn Eagle published the sermons of some of the main churches in the Monday issue. So I've read all his sermons, and half of them are about urban planning. He was a friend of Daniel Burnham's from when he preached in Chicago. Burnham was one of his parishioners or congregants, and in any case, he leads this effort to bring City Beautiful ideals to Brooklyn. Right, actually invites Daniel Burnham for a visit only months before Burnham dies. I call the title of that chapter is The Ministry of Improvement, which makes reference to improvements of another sort that he got very interested in late in life, namely eugenics. He was very disillusioned by World War I, and actually one of his last tracts that he writes calls for the sterilization of all German men as essentially as punishment for World War I. You know, a crazy idea until you consider that it might have prevented the Holocaust and World War II. So you have Brooklyn visionaries like Hillis on one side, who are answered by their Manhattanite peers, or Manhattanite expansionists, as I've called them. On the other hand, Andrew Green, who's moving out of the picture by now, but he would be a good example. And so to the Manhattanite expansionists, Consolidation turns Brooklyn into essentially this great field of dreams, this vast field onto which, this tabula rasa, onto which all sorts of metropolitan fantasies can be projected now, right? Because no longer the walled town, as Olmsted called it. Now New York has this great field upon which to grow. And so we enter this era, roughly from about 1900 to 1930, right, to the Depression era, and the arrival of Moses, really, in which an extraordinary range of very ambitious, mostly very stupid, and poorly planned projects are proposed and promoted both by the Brooklyn, the Brooklyn elite and the Manhattan expansionist crowd, right? This is one of them, right? This was a plan that had various forms for over 2.5 decades to turn shallow, sandy, wildlife-rich Jamaica Bay into the world's largest deep-water seaport. Right there you can tell that there's something not right about this, right? Very far from the railheads in New Jersey, but, whatever. From an aerial view, it does look like a wonderful little harbor. It's interesting that even in the British colonial era, right, in the 18th century, and the Brits knew about navigation and seafaring and shipping, they never identified Jamaica Bay as a potential port or harbor. It doesn't even appear in their writings about the whole region, right? So they knew something that was forgotten here. But anyway, things like images like this galvanized really a whole generation to create this largest deep water. And this was stoked by or prompted by larger world affairs, specifically the completion of the imminent completion of the Panama Canal. Panama Canal set off this canal building craze, especially along the East Coast and Gulf. This was when Houston builds the ship canal. I think it was the ship canal. Yeah. And New Orleans builds the industrial canal, right? Everyone's getting ready for what is expected to be this great surge in canal, seaborne traffic and canal traffic. New York State does the barge canal in this period, right? The barge canal was here's the Panama Canal there. The barge canal was the much needed, much delayed upgrade of the old Erie Canal, right? And again, to ready the state for this predicted, by the way, this is construction of a section of the barge canal. It's somewhere east of Syracuse, I think. We've tried to nail this down, but in any case, that's my maternal grandfather right there, who worked on this project. He had a little, later, he had a little grocery store in Vinegar Hill. And so anyway, and there were canals proposed as part of the Jamaica Bay port. One was this canal leading to Flushing Bay, roughly in the alignment of what's the Van Wyck Expressway today. And again, that was a little bit of a nutty idea because you had to cross the terminal moraine there. So there were proposals to, build locks to bring it over the hill or actually tunnel underneath. The other one is off the image here, but it was basically a proposal to turn Coney Island Creek into a canal, which is why if you go down to the Home Depot there, off the Belt Parkway, you'll see a Canal Avenue, and that's a remnant of this. But this is one of these plans. What I should say, this was, as you probably got the impression, this was not a very good idea. It did have within it, buried too deeply, it turns out, some very wonderful ideas. The most extraordinary of which was this idea for a demount motor truck system. And you can see here the name demount is herein given to the truck because its body is demountable and because each chassis will use many demountable bodies. This, as far as I've been able to tell, is the first appearance of containerized shipping, the first time the idea of containerized shipping is ever floated. This is decades before it actually is promoted and acted upon by, I think, the founder of Sealand in the 50s, right? So had this one idea been taken out, it would have changed things dramatically, at least in terms of world trade. So anyway, shallow tidal pool, tidal estuary, this would have been endless dredging to make this work, right? And anyway, the canal boats were on their way out, right? This was envisioned as the great terminus of the New York State Barge Canal, but that was something that was already in the past, right? So here's another example of these vast projects that are promoted both by the Manhattan crowd and the Brooklyn elite. This is Marine Park, not the neighborhood that I grew up in, but the park that the neighborhood was named for, right? This was to be the largest urban recreation machine in the world, right? Garretson Creek turned into this so-called Long Canal, right? Designed by Charles Downing Lay, a Brooklyn landscape artist. He actually lived on Orange Street in Brooklyn Heights. Was a descendant of Andrew Jackson Downing, one of the great landscape architects and horticulturalists in early American history. So this was meant to be a great counterpoint to Prospect Park, right? Prospect Park was inland, right? It was an Anglo-American romantic landscape, right? Rustic and curvaceous. Marine Park was on the shore, right? It was all about Baroque formalism. It was kind of a Baroque landscape on steroids. Prospect Park was all about strolling and relaxation and contemplation. This was all about active sports, right? This was all about sweating and athleticism, and it was really meant to be to counter the lure of the vices of Coney Island and provide healthful, uplifting, morally pure recreation as a great relief valve for the masses, right? What's ironic here is that that Charles Downing Lay actually wins a silver medal in the notorious 1936 Berlin Olympics for this plan. Prior to World War II, art was actually a category of competition in the Olympics, and town planning was actually a subcategory. But of course, it had to have something to do with athleticism and sport, and this elided perfectly. So we all think that, you know, the first the first person to medal at the Olympics, at the 36 Olympics, was Jesse Owens. Of course, he was the most extraordinary American athlete there, but the first American to medal was actually Charles Downing Lay. There was also supposed to be an enormous football field. This is wrong. It was supposed to seat 200,000. That was part of the scheme. It was actually right here. Give you a sense of the scale here. This was, no, I'm sorry, it was 125,000. So Yankee Stadium, 50,000, right? So it was 2.5 times the size of Yankee Stadium. This is an aerial view of Marine Park under construction. That's Garrettson Inlet, Jamaica Bay, Floyd Bennett Field, which I'll talk about in a second, is up there. I grew up in this house right here, which we still own. That's Garrettson Beach there. This is where the stadium was going to go, and you could see the overlaid plan, what it would have been like. It was huge. This is the Ithaca, so ignore this, but here's Manhattan, overlaid at scale. That's how big the park would have been, right? What happens, another example of this projecting these grand schemes on this tabula rasa. Remember, this is all undeveloped land at the time. As plans for the park are underway, along comes this gentleman on the right, Congressman Sol Bloom, who represented the Upper East Side, who is appointed, I think, by Calvin Coolidge to head this commission in Washington to come up with ways of celebrating the bicentennial of Washington's birth, George Washington's birth. And he really gets into every aspect of Washington. There's endless artifacts produced by this commission, sent all across the country to encourage young people, and especially immigrants. I mean, there was an agenda to this. This was in a period of enormous immigration to encourage the absorption of these American values and ideals. You all probably, if you're thinking this is obscure history, I bet you all have Washington quarters in your pockets or purses. That was one of his ideas. The other was to have this great World's Fair, right? And he wanted it to be at Marine Park, right? Which was tabula rasa, right? The hell with the crabs and the horseshoe crabs and the fish, just, you know, was considered swampland. And that plan never comes to fruition, largely because the Philadelphia Expo was kind of a financial failure, and it scared everyone off. But it morphs into what becomes the 1939 New York World's Fair in Flushing. The whole idea is steered toward Flushing by none other than Robert Moses, who wanted everything directed that way to turn his ash dump into a great park. But initially, if you look at the early planning documents, it's the Washington World's Fair, in 1939 World's Fair. So, and of course, there's an enormous sculpture of Washington as the counterpoint to the Trilon and Paris Fair, and that's Sol Bloom's doing. As far as what happened in Marine Park, this is a rare example of Robert Moses as not the demon. Robert Moses took one look at Charles Lay's plan and said, this is a joke, threw it in the wastebasket, had his favored landscape architect, Gilmore Clark, who planned most of the parks and parkways in this region during the Moses years, and founded my department, actually, at Cornell. He was the first professor in my department. They replanted first like this, and then in a very semi-rural state, And Moses very directly tells them, let it remain mainly as wetland. And he later, of course, does this he's the main reason the Great Jamaica Bay Port project is finally killed, buried, nailed in its coffin, because Moses wants Jamaica Bay to remain largely undeveloped for recreation and wildlife purposes. The final project I want to talk about here is and this is again examples of these grand ambitions of the new metropolis being projected onto this tabula rasa, is New York's first municipal airport, right? Believe it or not, New York, and here too, it's a larger world affair that prompts this action, right? In this case, it's the Lindbergh flight in 1927, which is of course billed as New York to Paris. It was Mineola to Paris, but New Yorkers didn't like that. And why? There was no airfield in New York, right? New York did not have an airport in this late date, right, which is getting to almost the golden age of aviation, despite the fact that, remember the Sheepshead Bay racetrack I showed you an image of earlier? That had become a great motor speedway that effectively was New York's first aerodrome. The infield. In fact, this fellow, Cal Perry Rogers, was the first individual to fly an airplane across the continent. He took off from midfield of the Sheepshead Bay motorway. It was also a lot of the early women aviators flew there. Some of the first air shows in New York State were held there. But still, New York City did not have an official airfield. And so what is chosen for this? Again, the embattled marshes and wetlands of Jamaica Bay, which are filled in without a thought to the critters living there and the enormous ecological complexity of the place, right? And so this is a Floyd Bennett field, right? It's a failure from the get-go. It's too far from the centers of trade and commerce, right? And because of that, the Postal Service, or the Postal Department, I think it was called at the time, refuses to grant it the official designation as New York City, New York metropolitan area's mail hub. That was Newark, right? And LaGuardia, who was a pilot, who had been a pilot during World War I and was very interested in aviation, LaGuardia does everything in his power to try to wrest that designation away, right, from Newark to, why is this? Because it didn't pay back then to fly passengers alone. It was a losing proposition. You had to also be carrying the mails. If you were carrying the mails, then you can throw human beings in and call it a day. So whichever airport had the hub designation by the Postal Service was the one that was naturally going to become the center for passenger travel. And that then, as now, was Newark, right? It was one of LaGuardia's few failures, actually, as mayor. And the reason he failed, he had the misfortune of being in the mayor's office at the exact time that probably the most powerful postmaster general we've ever had was at the Postal Department, and that was James A. Farley. Right, he was a kingmaker. He got the job because he had helped make FDR president, and that was his perk. So Farley was not having any of this. Anyway, this is Floyd Bennett Field in its initial form. And one last note about Floyd Bennett Field. It does reach a certain measure of fame because it's from Floyd Bennett Field that this squadron of Grumman aircraft is actually flown around the Empire State Building in that famous scene in King Kong. The pilots weren't even told what it was all about. They were just given $10 each to jazz up the Empire State Building. This was a different era. Could you imagine that today? So those planes, so now, so by the time Floyd Bennett Field opens, right, 1930, 31, America has been plunged into the Great Depression, right? And it's in this period that the hopeful optimism that consolidation had brought about begins to curdle and sour, right? There are major demographic changes happening at this time that amplify this. For one, Brooklyn's old Anglo-Dutch order has completely crumbled by now, right? We tend to think of white flight as a post-war phenomenon, right? But the first rounds of departures actually began in the late teens and in the 20s as automobiles became more popular. And that's the period when the older Anglo-Dutch families are leaving Brooklyn, right? Leaving all those glorious brownstones, heading to places like Riverdale, Scarsdale, Bronxville, Tuxedo Park, Forest Hills Gardens, right? They're moving out. Why are they leaving? Well, they're trying to get away from all the Jews and Italians and others who are moving in, like including my own, family, right? This is they're moving in. This is a period in which you've got one of the greatest residential building booms in U.S. history underway. I made reference to it earlier with the 10-year tax holiday. I talk about this in one of my chapters. This is that period when the city basically sweeps down the outwash plain and fills in all that space between the sea and the moraine, right? And there are dozens, if not hundreds of little developers, big and little developers, active in this period. It's a fascinating area. I've only, Lynn, you know a bit about this. I really only scratched the surface of this in that chapter. Alexander Calder was one of the larger developers in this period. But it's these homes that people are moving up and out of the Lower East Side and up and out of places like Brownsville and moving to, right? And the developers, for the most part, are themselves white ethnics and recent immigrants, right? They are not the Anglo-Dutch elite who have largely left, right? There are, in fact, many of the architects of the neighborhood I grew up in, all Tudor Revival, very English, Anglo-looking buildings. The architect was a Jewish immigrant, the developer was a Jewish immigrant, the first owners were Jews that we bought our house from, right? We're only the second owners of this house. So this is a period that, now, these white ethnic newcomers, right, my own ancestors included, fiercely ambitious in their own right, certainly, but as a group also keenly aware of their provisional status, right, in American society. And in Brooklyn, those insecurities are kind of validated by the borough's own subaltern rank vis-a-vis here, vis-a-vis Manhattan, right? It was a lesser place, Brooklyn. It was an outer borough, right? And so what happens over time, and especially with the shock of the Depression, is that that healthy, robustly competitive relationship, that stance that Brooklyn has with New York, with Manhattan, this yearning to beat Manhattan at its own game, starts to erode, right? Consolidation obviously robbed Brooklyn of its municipal independence, but its real impact, and it's long delayed here, was to kind of sap Brooklyn's moxie and its sense of optimism, right? Brooklyn really comes to see itself as a vassal state, forever in Manhattan's shadow. It's the great underdog. It's loud and feisty and bombastic and in your face, but it's also consumed at the same time by a kind of almost fatal sense of inadequacy, right, and insecurity, right? And the ultimate symbol of all this is the Brooklyn Dodgers, right? You can't come up with a better, I mean, look at their mascot. It was a homeless man, right? And the Dodgers, and this is a team, as I'm sure many of you know, that's defeated in 6 out of 7 World Series outings with who else? The New York Yankees. I mean, you can't make this up, right? 6 out of 7, only to finally triumph in 1955. And what do? They leave town 2 years later, abandon, double-cross their fans, to head to that sunny national suburb of Los Angeles. And this Dodger betrayal, as it was called, it becomes a bitter trope for all the crushed hopes and failures of post-war Brooklyn. And you know, this is something I remember well from when I was a kid, because it was still in the air, especially because I have a name that, you know, everybody used to ask me, oh, are you related to Roy Campanella? As far as I know, I'm not, although far back in Italy, perhaps. And of course, the old joke that some of you may have heard that I remember from childhood was that you've got Hitler, Stalin, and Walter O'Malley in a room. Walter O'Malley was the owner of the Dodgers who took the team to LA. You've got a gun and 2 bullets. What do? Of course, the answer is you shoot Walter O'Malley twice. And this is really just the start of a long series of departures and closings of real anchor institutions, right, that rock the borough and signal the end of an era. Right? The Brooklyn Eagle shuts down in 1955, and in fact, it had already shut down by the time the Dodgers won the series. So one of the great stories of the century in Brooklyn, they're not there to report it, and it's left to the New York dailies to report. Right? So the Brooklyn Eagle shuts down, and the borough loses its voice. Ebbets Field is razed in 1960. Right? I can't quite fathom the joy that is obviously expressed here in this image, but this is, you know, it was a different age. Steeplechase Park is torn down. Well, it closes in 1964, and it's torn down not long after by this guy. Anyone want to guess? This is Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father. This was the great Pavilion of Fun at Steeplechase, which was an extraordinary building. One of my granduncles, my Uncle Jimmy, was the general manager of Steeplechase Park for about 42 years. And I have all his diaries and day books. A lot of that is actually made its way into a couple of my chapters. And then you have the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And to talk about anchor institutions, this is a place that employed, during World War II, 75,000 people, right? I mean, that's bigger than Chapel Hill, and certainly a lot bigger than Ithaca, right? And this closes in 1966. And this is a place that had created some of the greatest warships in American history, gone, right? You know, so this is a real trauma, right? A series of blows. It's astonishing, you know, given Brooklyn's soaring stock value today, to read of the loathing of Brooklynites past for their native place, right? Henry Miller reviled Bushwick and Williamsburg, where he grew up. He described Myrtle Avenue as, I'm quoting here, a street not of sorrow, for sorrow would be human and recognizable, but of sheer emptiness. It is emptier than the most extinct volcano, than the word of God in the mouth of an unbeliever. See Myrtle Avenue before you die, if only to realize how far into the future Dante saw. not topophilia. Right? For Miller, for Alfred Kazin, Norman Potteritz, many others, or my own mother, for example. I remember my mother was scornful of friends and family who did not move out of the old neighborhood, which was hard by in fact, this was her street. My grandparents had a little grocery store here. This is Hudson Avenue. This is still here, the Borum and Pease building. The Navy Yard wall is here. This is a school now. I forget the number, 307 maybe. I mean, she had real scorn for the people that did not. You know, I put it in an essay a couple of years ago that the mark of arrival was to leave, right? And others have said as much. Pete Hamill put it this way. He said when he was talking about his childhood, he said the idea was to get out. You know, that was what you aimed for, to get out of Brooklyn, right? Not to come to Williamsburg. Place shame of this sort, place loathing, I don't have a term for it, but of this sort, for one's own cradle and home, does not make for a population of keen community activists, right? Especially when it's fused to poverty and a lack of education. And I think this helps explain why Brooklynites in the post-war years, right, tolerate with a kind of grim resignation really some of the most egregious acts of urban vandalism in America, right? Some of the largest urban renewal projects, demolition campaigns, expressway projects, public housing projects are punched through Brooklyn, and there's almost no trace of an organized resistance. Totally unlike in the case of the Cross Bronx Expressway, which Robert Caro and others have documented well, where the East Tremont neighborhood really rose up and opposed and fought Moses bitterly. You didn't have this in Brooklyn, and these were projects that were actually more extensive and had greater impact. The Brooklyn-Queens Expressway was much, much longer and affected many more people than the Cross Bronx Expressway, right? On the other hand, it's also likely that Brooklyn's strange alchemy of ambition with a side of self-loathing is precisely why the borough has churned out, you know, arguably more raw talent than I think any comparable city, any city of similar size in the United States, right? I mean, the sons and daughters of Brooklyn. Well, these are some of the projects. This is the largest public housing project in U.S. history, the Fort Greene houses, which we don't refer to as that anymore because it was administratively broken up into the Ingersoll and Whitman houses. But this just carpet bombed an entire neighborhood, an African-American neighborhood actually, just south of the Navy Yard. Cross Bronx Expressway heading through Williamsburg. You know, this is gratuitous, but I mean, and it's partial. But you know, the sons and daughters of Brooklyn, they're hungry, they're straining at the harness, they're eager to prove themselves to this cynical, mocking world, or at least to that Emerald City across the East River, right? And of course, they do just that. You know, there's hardly a quarter or corner of American life that Brooklynites have not touched or transformed. That said, you know, self-loathing is generally returned with interest by the world. For much of the 20th century, Brooklyn really was a kind of punching bag of cities, right? The butt of jokes, the object of ridicule. The husky accent of Brooklynites was mocked from stage and screen roundly. And the ridicule could be brutal at times, and it always the most withering came from the Manhattanite cognoscenti. James Agee, for example, who I shouldn't beat on him, he had a very short and tragic life, but Exeter, Harvard diplomas in hand, he was sent by Fortune magazine to write a piece about Brooklyn. It was a total failure. Fortune refused to publish it. It was published a couple of years ago in a little book, but he described Brooklyn, and I'm quoting, as an exorbitant, pulsing mass of scarcely discriminable cellular jellies and tissues, a place where people merely live. You know, sorry. He observed there, and I'm quoting again, a curious quality in the eyes and at the corners of the mouths relative to what is seen on Manhattan Island. A kind of drugged softness or narcotic relaxation, like that often seen in monasteries and on the lawns of sanitaria. Truman Capote, on the right, saw Brooklyn as a kind of homeland of mediocrity, a Philistine realm, as he called it, a veld of tawdriness filled with sad, sweet, violent children. But Capote also understood the borough's vast complexity better than most, right? He called it, in a famous line, sad, brutal, provincial, lonesome, human, silent, sprawling, raucous, lost, passionate, subtle, bitter, immature, perverse, tender, mysterious. Capote moved to Brooklyn Heights, not long after he penned those words, renting an apartment on Willow Street in this home that was owned by his friend Oliver Smith, one of the February House denizens. which enabled him, now a resident, to deliver what I really think is the greatest backhanded compliment a city that's ever been paid to a city. I live in Brooklyn, he wrote, by choice. Thank you.
I believe there would be questions.
Yes.
Do you want to?
Do, yes. Ask away.
Don't be shy.
I reminded that there was a large contingent of Brooklynists that went to Walter O'Malley's funeral a couple of years ago, just to make sure.
I should add that at the end of that joke, but it kind of would ruin the effect a little. Yeah, you know, I should say on that note, and this has been clarified not only by me, by others who've written about, one of the more scrutinized aspects of Brooklyn's cultural history has been the Dodger legacy and the many efforts to keep them and I have a lot of one chapter on that too. But really the demon in that picture was Robert Moses.
Yeah.
It really was not Walter O'Malley. O'Malley tried endlessly to keep the Dodgers in Brooklyn, but at every turn was confronted with Moses and his desire to move every and all things out to Flushing, where eventually he built Shea Stadium for a whole new ball team. It really is a much more complex story than the Hitler, Stalin, and O'Malley in 2 bullets. Yeah.
I was wondering if you touched on at all the possible effects of like the brewing industry leaving Brooklyn during Prohibition and everything. I know that like Brooklyn was referred to during that period having like a brewery every 2 blocks basically, and then by the Depression those were all gone basically.
So there was a lot of illegal brewing of various potions in Brooklyn in various eras. Actually, Barren Island, where Floyd Bennett Field is later built, was notorious for illegal stills and all that the products of which were shipped at night around to the Navy Yard district, which was Vinegar Hill now, which is generally known as, but was known then as the 5th Ward. It's one of the poorest parts of New York City. And there were lots of bars and pubs there that sold this. I don't know too much about that subject. I do know that Brooklyn was a major center for beer brewing until the post-war period, right up into the 70s. I still remember the Rheingold, I think it was Rheingold Brewery in Brownsville, because my dad's shop, my dad had an electric motor shop, and one of his suppliers was out there. We used to go out there often, and they all closed in the very turbulent era right after World War II of labor and management clashes. There were a lot of strikes, and that was the beginning of a lot of companies moving out of or just shutting down. It wasn't only because of the strikes. It was a very complex web of issues, outdated infrastructure, inaccessibility, rising taxes, but the labor unrest was certainly part of it. And I think we went from something like 20 breweries down to, I think the last one closed around in the early 70s. And until, of course, the hipster revival of the millennial hipster revival of beer, and now there must be 20 or 30 brew pubs at least. In the back there, yeah.
Yeah, what do you think of Rem Koolhaas's view of Coney Island in Delirious New York?
Should I quote his somewhat X-rated version of describing? He described Coney Island as a clitoral appendage at the mouth of New York Harbor. It's brilliant. I think Rem Koolhaas is brilliant. His architecture, I teach in one of his buildings. I'll leave that aside. But that book is ingenious. And yeah, I mean, that notion of Coney Island as this great relief valve that enabled Manhattan and its hyperdensity to exist, to be. That's brilliant, and I think that's really that's the way Coney Island functioned until the World War II, until the post-war era. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to see if you can comment about the effects of the lack of rail infrastructure, especially direct land connections to the rest of the U.S. on Brooklyn.
Well, it's one of the reasons that great port plan for Jamaica Bay was such folly. There was, you may have seen in one of those images there, I'll get rid of these guys. There was actually a great rail terminal that was proposed as part of, and the rail line was going to hook all, I don't have a copy of my book in front of me, but it was going to hook all the way up through and cross Manhattan Island and somehow connect to the mainland. But it was a reach. I mean, it wasn't going to work. That was the, you know, it was a tiny thread connecting this. And of course, they were mainly thinking in terms of canals and boats at that time, so it really wasn't an emphasis. But it would have doomed it. It would have doomed it. Rail connectivity has always been a problem for Brooklyn. There was the plan to tunnel underneath the Narrows, and I think part of that tunnel was still exists because it was started. Yeah.
Yeah, mentioning the rail, it brought back to my mind because I grew up in Bergen Beach, and Bergen Beach had an amusement park.
Yeah.
Which if you look at some books of photos of Times Square, you see go to Bergen Beach Amusement
Right.
Park. And the reason Bergen Beach Amusement Park died out was because they didn't have the subway lines to go there at Coney Island, which Coney Island
Right.
did have. And
Yeah, well, Bergen Beach, that's still a real issue today, because if you look at a heat map or a walkability map to stations, that part of Brooklyn, from Canarsie, Mill Basin, and Flatlands and Marine Park is really one of the largest transit deserts in New York City. It wasn't meant to be. There were proposals, there were plans to extend the 4 or 5 line from the junction from Brooklyn College to down Flatbush Avenue to Floyd Bennett Field, to the airport. There were plans to drive one of the other lines, I think the 2 or the 3, down Nostrand Avenue from the junction to Sheepshead Bay, and then there's the much vaunted Utica Avenue line that the mayor has talked about. He doesn't talk about it anymore, but he did at the beginning of his administration about extending. Any of those would irrigate that huge transit desert there, but they're not going to happen. The first time the city was on the verge of pushing them through was during I think it was in the 20s or early 30s. But they wanted, no, it was in the late 30s, I'm sorry. But they wanted to build them as elevated. And there was a fierce backlash in all those communities, because it was ironic, because it was at that very time that Brooklyn was taking down the L's everywhere else. And there was this sense of, oh, you're taking them down for Brooklyn Heights and, you know, and all those neighborhoods, but now you're going to dump them on us. No. The next time that the city was on the verge of building these, extending these lines, was in the 60s. And then you had the communities rise up and say, we don't want them, we don't want the problems that we don't want those people coming down the subway to our neighborhood. So now we have that.
Bergen Beach technically was a sundown town when I grew up there. Again, the only African Americans you ever saw were the maids that were going to a house.
I didn't know that.
And leaving at 5 o'clock.
Huh.
You did not see anything other than, you know, Irish, Italian, or Jewish faces in that whole community.
Well,
and I was up there in '79, it was still the same.
Yeah, there's been a bit written about, not Bergen Beach, but about Canarsie in terms of race and pushback against integration and diversification. I can't remember the fellow's name, but there is a book about race in Canarsie that I may mention somewhere in my book. Yes.
Speaking of those hipster breweries,
Yeah.
what do you make of Brooklyn's gentrification?
Nah,
That's
how many hours do you have? Just a little subject.
And could you have predicted that when you were a kid?
Oh,
Did you
God,
think
no.
everything that would happen?
Could you imagine how rich I'd be if I could? I've been thinking of doing a collection of essays by people telling about their the one that got away real estate stories. It'd be like a volume like this in I don't think anybody saw it coming. Well, no, some people did. I think David Walenta saw it coming. And kudos to him. I mean, it's amazing that he was able to fathom that. But it's a very complex subject, and it's a very contentious subject, certainly in the urban planning field, because at any given moment, half of our activity as urban planners is trying to stimulate urban revitalization and development, and then the other half is trying to control the beast that we've unleashed. So it's a tough one. But as far as the spread of, I'm not a scholar on this. I haven't done deep studies or research on gentrification. Some have, and have found, frankly, that some of the shibboleths that we sort of assume may not be as true as we've thought. Some of the work that's come out of Columbia and the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank recently published some research that actually suggests that the displacement is not as widespread and is not as universal as we've thought of the people living there. That the benefits that gentrification bring to a place, I could just hear Spike Lee screaming. That benefit everyone, not equally, but they bring benefits to others too. So, but it's very debatable. As far as the spread of gentrification in Brooklyn, I don't know how much further you're going to see it plunge down the outwash plain. What you're bumping up against is travel time to Manhattan, and you're also bumping up against the kind of amenity array that the people who are driving gentrification want. In my neighborhood, there actually are some young families that I would, or couples or individuals that seem hipsterish. Moving in because it's still very affordable and it's got parks and proximity to the ocean, but it doesn't have the bars and the galleries and the yoga studios and the cafes that make a place. We only just recently got our first cafe that knows how to do a good latte or cappuccino. If you're interested, the final part of the book, I talk about a little seat of the pants study I did. I actually wrote about this for City Lab. I walked the entire length of Flatbush Avenue one summer night, indicating and mapping on my iPhone the presence of those lovely retro style Edison light bulbs. And there's not a single one from Avenue U till about Church Avenue. Not a single one. This was a couple of years ago. And then suddenly, boom, 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 boom. And by the time you get to Prospect Lefferts Garden and Gardens and certainly when you're getting close to Park Slope, it's every shop, every single shop. And that's changed a bit now. I notice some places in my neighborhood have them too. I have them, so I love them. My house is filled with them. Yeah.
You drew an interesting connection at the very beginning between Terminal and Moraine, and then all of the hipster neighborhoods on one side and the outwash on the other side.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, how much of that would have been simply coincidence and the proximity of all those neighborhoods to Manhattan?
Yeah, and it's not just proximity to Manhattan, it's also presence of really wonderful old historic architecture. It's also the fact that those were neighborhoods that underwent steep decline in the post-war period and were, there was a kind of vacuum there, at least in terms of market headroom. My neighborhood, for example, never went through that cycle. It had always been and still is kind of a middle-class neighborhood. It never bottomed out, right? So yeah, it's not only that. But it also, if you look at the development history, it does line up nicely. The building, the construction up to 1915, it just crawls up the moraine and it just stalls out there for about 15 years, and then it's pushed down over, and it's a whole different era, it's a whole different kind of architectural style, different set of builders. So it's not the only thing at work, the glacial topography, but it certainly is there, and it certainly is a presence today.
This seems like a good point to take a demographic survey of the audience to find out how many people are from Brooklyn here tonight. Raise your hands.
Wow.
All right. And, okay, born and bred in Brooklyn? Okay, there.
Wow,
Okay,
that's
so take
great.
that, maybe take a picture of that. and tweet it. Yeah.
You know, when I gave a talk in Ithaca, and I'll tell you about half the room, and it was a big crowd. It was like at least as big as this, and it was half the crowd was from Brooklyn in Ithaca.
Well, I think we should all thank Tom, but especially the Brooklynites. So, how many people are here for the first time tonight? Anyone? Oh, quite a few. So obviously you are friends of Tom, of Tomdom, and we will get right to the point of the talk after I very briefly explain for the new people that I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the Skyscraper Museum, and we do talks like this, authors' talks on subjects of New York City history, of skyscraper history, of urbanism around the world. Once a month. And let me just mention, for those who want to come back, lure you back next month on February 26th, A.K. Sandoval Strauss is going to be talking about his new book, Barrio America, How Latino Immigrants Saved America, actually, or saved cities, I guess. And so that's a good example of the eclecticism, but also the historical focus, because A.K. is also a historian, as is Tom Campanella. But what I've been learning from Tom just now, talking about some of his deep background, professional background and academic, is that he's also a landscape architect, which makes perfect sense with his book profile, his writing profile, but also his sensitivity to topics of the environment and of parks. Indeed, he serves as the historian for the New York City Department of Parks as a sideline. He's a professor, associate professor at Cornell, where back in the day he studied landscape architecture to kind of make this whole kind of melange of city and nature come together in the way that he shall I say, inimitably does in his work. And he did his dissertation at MIT with one of the professors sitting here in the middle, probably making him just a little bit nervous, Gary Hack, and about the history of landscape architecture. So he was born and bred in Brooklyn, which I suppose is the reason for the topic, as he will describe for us tonight. But I know him best as a kind of city and regional planning historian from various conferences, where the books that introduce Tom's work to me are as eclectic in a way, or as disparate as the, let's see, it was 2001, Cities from the Sky, which were aerial views of American cities from the Fairchild aerial surveys, if you know those absolutely fantastic photographs, mostly from the 30s and after, that capture American cities in the kind of early modern period. So that was with Princeton Architectural Press, and then they were lucky to have him for a second publication, which really wasn't a PAP kind of book at all, The Concrete Dragon, which was published in 2008 and has the subtitle, China's Urban Revolution and What It Means to the World. So that was an ambitious topic, just as viewing America from 30,000 feet, as it were, is an embracing vision. And it seems to me that what I recall best about, I have to confess I haven't read this book, but I have read Concrete Dragon, so that's why I'm using it as the introduction, because it really is an extraordinary book to capture many cities of a developing China, with a phrase that stuck with me. Maybe it's not your phrase, but it was well said and early in the book, as the land of China and the Chinese people underwent a relocation from the west to the coast, the west to the east, which is the largest migration, the largest mass migration in human history. which is a phrase that you don't get to say very often. Right? So, but captures the scale, the incredible, overwhelming, sort of mind-blowing scale of that operation. And Tom and the Concrete Dragon explains a lot of this, kind of city by city, and the specialization and the urbanization with what were, you can't describe them as small cities if they're now 1 million, 2 million, 10 million people, but with that kind of urban development. So from cities from the sky to cities in a continent with the largest population of people in the world, Tom has a way of mastering big topics. And Brooklyn isn't that big, but it's pretty damn big as a topic, and it's a book that's almost as fat as Gotham and Greater Gotham, when Mike Wallace talked about that here at the museum, and also sat in the chair watching other people, and Tom talk about his book on another occasion. So I will let you all listen to him now, but this book is an enormous accomplishment on a subject which is very big, but is made understandable by an excellent historian and scholar.
Thank you.